sexy guys do. Explore what's soul in their minds. Yeah, about a thing or two, about a thing or two, about a thing or two. Mansplaining is deciding you're gonna search for the truth. Mansplain me, baby. Mansplain. There can be no taking back what we are cool.
Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name is Joe. I'm your host for this week. And as always, I'm joined by my college friend, Mark. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully, as our excellent new theme song says, figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. I love that new song, Mark.
Yeah, it definitely makes us seem a lot cooler than we are.
And we're taping this right before Memorial Day weekend, entering a time of really nice weather, at least here in New York. People like to escape the confines of their contained spaces when the weather is nice. And that lends itself, I think, to a discussion of bail reform. Wouldn't you agree?
Brilliant segue, Joe, yes. Masterfully done.
From the man who specializes in segues, that's high praise. So anyway, I asked you about bail reform, something that's been on my mind several years ago. A bunch of jurisdictions with liberal prosecutors implemented bail reform, laws passed by their municipalities or states. I thought it was an interesting experiment and was anxious to see what came of it. And shortly thereafter, there was a measurable increase in crime. At least I believe there was. You can put that myth to rest if it wasn't true. But suddenly, conservatives blamed bail reform on the rise in crime. And I'm wondering, is that really true? Is bail reform to blame for a rise in crime experienced in many parts of the country over the last few years? So I put the question to you, Mark, and I'm interested to hear what the answer is.
Well, as always, thank you for the question. I think it's interesting that there are parts of our world that we never really think to question. They seem as natural part of the world as the color of the sky. And bail is one of those things for me. I never really thought to question our system of bail until you asked this question. I just kind of took it for granted, but I learned a lot in researching this one.
Good.
Anyway, as background for our listeners, the bail reform movement is a nationwide effort to overhaul the cash bail system in the United States on the grounds that bail, as it's used today in the American legal system, has had the effect of criminalizing poverty and disproportionately impacting low-income individuals and communities of color. We'll get into the specific measures that the reform movement has proposed later on, but first I want to spend some time talking about how we got here. The history of our bail system stretches back to medieval times. In medieval England, the Anglo-Saxons developed a system of sureties or pledges, under which an individual accused of a crime could be released from custody if they could find a person of good standing, often a relative or another member of the community, who would guarantee their appearance at trial. This person would effectively take responsibility for ensuring that the accused would not flee. So by this point, money was not part of the equation. Bail was more of a social and communal system that allowed an accused person to be released until the trial could be held. During the Norman period in England following the Norman conquest of 1066, the English legal system started to formalize, and laws started to get written down. In 1275, the Statute of Westminster listed specific offenses that were bailable and set out the conditions under which bail could be denied, such as in cases of murder or treason. In the 14th century and following, the use of property as collateral for bail began to become more prominent. Courts started to accept land, valuables, and eventually money as forms of bail. By the 18th century, the use of cash bail had become more widespread and formally recognized. This shift to a monetary system was driven by the need for a standardized method of ensuring court appearances, especially as urban centers grew and it became more difficult to track down the people who might have guaranteed that a defendant would show up at trial. When the system was transferred to America by British colonists, principles such as reasonable bail amounts and non-punitive pretrial detention were already well established, and these ideas were encoded in the U.S. Constitution with the Eighth Amendment. However, critics charge that the modern cash bail system in the U.S. has diverged significantly from its original intent. Courts frequently set cash bail amounts that many defendants cannot afford, which can result in prolonged pretrial detention. Naturally, this disproportionately impacts low-income individuals and marginalized communities, which has led to arguments that our modern cash bail system violates the principle of equal protection of the law, and that all this is propped up by a for-profit bail industry that is actively lobbying to protect its profits.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the for-profit part, because I've long heard complaints about bail that it's basically a cash grab, revenue-generating system, sometimes to help cash-strapped municipalities. So there is a profit element in this, and that needs to be acknowledged, I think.
Yeah. One thing that I learned in the process of researching this is that when you get bail from a bail bondsman, you pay a fee, and that fee is non-refundable. Your bail is refunded if you show up at trial, but the fee is not. And often those fees are so high that they are an economic burden for the accused, even if they show up at trial and the bail is returned.
Right. Yeah. And as you mentioned at the top, your liberty shouldn't depend on your wealth.
Right.
That's so crazy.
Yeah. Now, the bail reform movement had its origins in the middle of the 20th century. In the 1960s, many studies reported hardships that the system imposed on poor defendants who could not afford bail, while wealthier individuals, regardless of the severity of their crime or the risk that they would flee rather than stand trial, were able to secure their release. And the Bail Reform Act of 1966 was the first legislative act to address these inequities by reducing reliance on cash bail and encouraging the use of non-monetary conditions for pretrial release. In the 70s and 80s, however, rising crime rates and concerns over public safety fueled a tough-on-crime movement that reintroduced stringent bail practices and promoted preventative detention. Between 1970 and 2011, the pretrial jail population in the U.S. increased by 433%, largely due to judges relying more and more on cash bail and setting it at amounts that the accused cannot afford. The median bail amount set by courts in 2015 for people facing a felony accusation was $10,000, while the median adult income for a person in pretrial detention that year was $15,109.
Wow.
People detained pretrial now make up more than 2/3 of America's jail population, a figure that absolutely blew my mind when I learned it. And this comes at a high cost to taxpayers, because not all of these detainees are guilty of the charges against them. According to the American Bar Association, the tax bill for incarcerating people who are later acquitted at trial comes to $14 billion every year. So $14 billion every year goes towards imprisoning innocent people.
Wow.
This transformed bail into a mechanism for wealth-based detention rather than its original purpose as an incentive to return to court. After courts set bail amounts, people who can't afford that cost return home to their lives, prepare for their defense, and ultimately recoup their payment after returning to court. People who cannot afford bail are left behind bars for the duration of their case, often for months or even for years. During that time, they might lose their job, lose their home, and lose all connection with friends and family. And partly as a result of these effects, research shows that people detained pretrial are more likely to plead guilty, leading to higher conviction rates and harsher punishments than their released counterparts.
Yeah, that's sickening. Ugh.
Yeah.
That's the sign of a morally bankrupt system in my mind.
Yeah. It's hard to justify a system that incentivizes people to plead guilty even if they're not guilty of the charges against them.
Yeah.
Now, all of this disproportionately affects low-income and minority populations. Data shows that judges often set lower bail for white defendants than they do for minorities, particularly black defendants. When comparing black and white individuals in one study, black defendants were 3.6% more likely to be assigned bail, and they received bail amounts that were, on average, more than $7,000 higher. The bail reform movement aims to address these inequities. Various measures have been proposed and, in some cases, put into effect. First, eliminating any requirement that cash bail must be set as a condition for pretrial release, essentially putting it within the judgment and discretion of the judge. One alternative to cash bail is the use of unsecured bonds, where defendants are released by promising to pay a set amount if they fail to appear in court. Without any upfront payments, more defendants are able to meet the requirement. Many jurisdictions have also tried implementing evidence-based risk assessment tools to evaluate a defendant's flight risk and threat to public safety. Release decisions would be based on these assessments instead of the accused's ability to pay bail. Low-cost interventions can also be part of the system, such as reminders sent by phone call, text messages, and mail. Some studies have shown that these reminders can increase court appearances rates by up to 42%.
The simplest solution.
Yeah.
Often the most effective.
Right. Another suggested reform is pretrial supervision, programs that serve to monitor and supervise released defendants, such as regular check-ins. For lower-level offenses, some jurisdictions have implemented cite and release policies where individuals are issued a citation with a future court date instead of being arrested and jailed, which avoids the need for cash bail entirely. Now, the reform movement has gained traction in several states, but in some cases, those changes were later rolled back. New Jersey virtually eliminated cash bail in 2017 through the Criminal Justice Reform Act. The state now uses a risk assessment tool to determine whether defendants should be released or detained pretrial based on public safety risks rather than their ability to pay bail, and pretrial detention numbers have been reduced by 20%. The Vera Institute of Justice reports that New Jersey, by reducing the prison population in the state, saved $1 billion over 3 years after implementing bail reform. New York passed bail reform legislation in 2019 that eliminated cash bail for most misdemeanor and nonviolent felony cases. However, that legislation faced significant backlash and was partially rolled back in 2020.
Can I just say that backlash you just described in New York State is probably the reason why I'm asking you this question, because there's been a lot of talk about bail reform locally where I live.
Yeah, I suspected as much. Following a lawsuit, Harris County in Texas, which includes the city of Houston, agreed in 2019 to implement risk-based pretrial release decisions and reduce its reliance on cash bail. In 2018, California passed a law to eliminate cash bail, but it was never implemented due to a referendum that overturned it in 2020. The Illinois legislature passed the Pretrial Fairness Act in 2021, which mandated the elimination of cash bail throughout the state in 2023 and requires the use of risk assessment tools for detention decisions. Colorado's HB 21-1315, signed into law in 2021, eliminated cash bail for most low-level offenses, requiring courts to release defendants on personal recognizance bonds unless there's evidence indicating risk of harm or flight.
Yeah. All the states you've mentioned thus far, Colorado, California, Illinois, New York, New Jersey, Houston, the bluest part of Texas, they're all liberal jurisdictions.
Sure.
Just want to make sure people understand that.
Other states like New Mexico, Kentucky, Wisconsin, and Alaska, so, a couple red states in there, have also enacted various bail reform measures, such as limiting cash bail, implementing risk assessment tools, and creating pretrial services programs. For every action, though, there is a reaction, and bail reform measures have triggered significant political opposition, particularly from, as you say, conservative, tough-on-crime politicians. In a number of states, Republican legislators introduced bills aiming at increasing the number of non-bailable offenses and requiring judges to consider criminal records when setting bail amounts. There have been several arguments articulated against bail reform. First, opponents have claimed that releasing more defendants awaiting trial rather than simply detaining them gives them an opportunity to commit more crimes. Critics have also argued that eliminating cash bail removes a deterrent and makes defendants less accountable for their actions, which could embolden criminal behavior. There is no evidence to support these claims, however. Studies across multiple states and cities found no increased crime rates in jurisdictions that implemented bail reforms. For example, in New York, the rearrest rate for defendants released pretrial actually decreased from the 50% rate in the pre-reform period to 44% over the 2-year period in which bail reform measures were active. Similarly, analyses in jurisdictions like New Jersey, Harris County, Texas, and others found either small decreases or no statistically significant changes in rearrest rates for violent felonies or new criminal activity by those released pretrial after bail reforms. And the rise of violent crime during the pandemic occurred in areas both with and without bail reform policies in place. So you don't really have a cause and effect going on there.
With minds like steel tracks, walking door here to discern the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. And explain, it's a calling and they do it for you. Explain me, baby. Explain, it's a calling that you don't do it too.
Opponents often point to individual cases where a defendant released pretrial committed a serious crime as proof that bail reform endangers public safety. However, these anecdotal episodes, as tragic as they are, do not reflect the findings of comprehensive studies. Studies that cover entire jurisdictions have consistently shown that bail reform models do not lead to overall increases in crime or rearrest rates compared to pre-reform periods. To my ears, the most cogent criticism of bail reform is that these measures require significant resources if they're to be run properly. Effective bail reform requires dedicating resources to implement evidence-based risk assessment tools, pretrial services, supervision programs, and the other alternatives to cash bail. All too often, we tend to pass well-meaning legislation without accounting for the sometimes high associated costs that come due every single year going forward.
Yeah.
I do think that it's quite a bit easier to call for bail reform than it is to practice bail reform effectively.
Yeah, the proverbial unfunded mandate, right?
Yeah.
We've had so many cases of that. Congress passes some kind of bill. They don't provide any money behind it, so it falls flat on its face and becomes a ripe target for backlash.
Yeah, exactly. I can, though, offer a pretty unequivocal answer to your original question. To date, the evidence shows no clear connection between bail reform and rising crime rates. Our arguments about what to do about crime, though, are almost always more emotional than analytical. The heartbreaking story of one innocent person who was brutalized by a defendant released without bail will always outweigh evidence gleaned from thousands of other cases in which no such thing happened. Remember, George Bush Sr. was elected president partly because his campaign highlighted a prison furlough program instituted while his opponent was governor of Massachusetts,
Yes.
which released a prisoner named Willie Horton who raped and murdered a woman following his release. Horrible thing. That furlough program, though, was responsible for the release of nearly 9,000 prisoners, but Willie Horton was the only one we heard about.
Right.
Now, that was not an example of bail reform, but it shows the same scenario. An emotional appeal designed to inspire fear, coupled with a tough on crime mandate, has repeatedly shown itself to be more effective politically than the reverse. Broadly speaking, we have two choices in our lives: to operate in a spirit of hope or to operate in a spirit of fear. Bail reform is driven by hope, that young men can be kept out of prison, that communities can be repaired, that tomorrow might be better than today. Opposition to bail reform is driven by fear, that someone you love will be the victim of violent crime, that people who don't look like us might be our enemies, that tomorrow might be worse than today. Personally, I lean towards hope, but I am less hopeful for bail reform because, politically speaking, fear trumps hope almost every time. Would you agree?
I would agree, sadly. But boy, I think your answer is spot on. It is what I expected to hear, and I'm glad to hear it too. And I agree wholeheartedly with your conclusion. So this isn't the first time that we've discussed that primitive fear response guiding our politics. So that's also a recurring issue for this podcast, sadly. I want to talk to you about a couple of things you said early on about the non-monetary conditions that you mentioned were in the 1966 bill, but kind of got quickly ignored because of backlash. I wanted to discuss a couple of the types of non-monetary conditions that might be compromise positions if you're dead set against revoking bail. You know, like electronic monitoring, for example.
Yeah.
Judge's discretion is another one that I have often heard and read about.
I did see some discussion of that, which I didn't include, so we can go into it a little bit deeper here, which is that some people are concerned about the judge's discretion
Yes.
bit because they are more comfortable with prescriptive measures because then you're not depending on the judge to overcome his own biases. For instance, if you have a judge in the Deep South who comes down hard on Black defendants, if you give that judge more leniency in terms of determining what to do with a given case, you can anticipate that he's going to come down hard on Black defendants.
Right.
And from that point of view, you don't want judicial discretion. You want to have a mandate in every situation. You see this, you do that.
Right.
And, I can see some sense in that, but I'm a little uncomfortable with rigid measures because rigid measures have been so much used by the tough on crime movement to mandate sentencing, for instance, to remove things from the possibility of bail being set. I am uncomfortable with the idea of coming up with a system that thinks it's going to be prescriptive for every possible scenario.
Yes.
And that would produce justice in the end. That seems naive to me.
Yes. And, judge's discretion in and of itself is not a rigid measure, but given the reality that you just described, it could easily become a rigid measure if a judge is a law and order doctrinaire judge who might have unconscious biases against poor people or people of color. Then this seemingly non-doctrinaire concept of judge's discretion could be used in a doctrinaire way.
Right. I think everyone is a fan of judicial discretion when that judge is ruling in a direction that they like.
Yeah.
Right. We hate judicial discretion when that judge seems to make a completely unreasonable ruling.
Right.
And yet it's not uncommon to hear about a judge making an unreasonable ruling.
Yes.
So judicial discretion is definitely a blade that cuts both ways.
Now, another concept that's come up among the backlash crowd, the people who would like to get rid of bail reform laws, is setting some kind of dangerousness standard. That's the phrase I've heard, a dangerousness standard in assessing bail. So if the defendant has a violent history, if they've been in and out of jail before for more violent crimes, the judge can then assess bail in that case based on the defendant's history. And I feel like that can also lead to the same kind of racial bias that you described before.
Mm-hmm. I also think it kind of evokes the fear versus hope lens that I was using earlier, which is what do we hope for with someone who has a criminal record? Do we hope to reform that person and that they will eventually be a functioning member of society? Or do we fear that that person is just bad to the bone and therefore we should lock him away for good?
Yes.
And so depending on how you come to these things, if you come to it with an attitude of hope, you don't want the fact that that person made mistakes in the past to doom them to always get in the short stick whenever there's any discretion. And the flip side is if you think that bad people are just bad people, then the last thing you want them to do is to get another chance to be bad.
Yeah. Recent increases in crime during this period, especially in 2021, 2022, can be equally ascribed to COVID, the effects of COVID, and also the effects of rampant gun usage, at least as much as bail reform, if not more. You can finger the COVID pandemic and guns everywhere all the time as reason for the uptick in crime.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that harkens back to our episode on crime statistics, which we did in February of 2022, just as the crime was spiking again in the country, that we were discussing how COVID had a lot to do with that spike.
Right. I'm struck in retrospect, looking back to COVID, at just how much unrest there was, the social, political unrest. Part of that was a function of the Trump administration. But also, I think part of it was a function of just how much pressure everybody was under for so long with COVID and the fear and the uncertainty and the anger at people who either were or were not wearing masks, depending on your perspective on that, and the job loss and the loss of income within communities that depended on those jobs. And so I think in retrospect, it's not that surprising that bad things happened because people were in a bad way. And I think ultimately we might come around to the viewpoint that the spike in crime during COVID was kind of a lashing out of the society as a whole after a period of tremendous stress.
Yes.
And that basically, we were just in a bad spot. I feel like that contributed significantly to those stats.
A historical anomaly, once in a lifetime, or hopefully once in our lifetime.
Right.
A medical pandemic situation.
Knock on wood.
Yeah. And then one other thing, the anti-bail reform crowd would have you believe that bail reform is singularly responsible for the rise in crime that happened a few years ago, as we just discussed. But one thing they conveniently leave out is that crime rose everywhere in 2021 and 2022, not just in liberal New York or Houston or Baltimore or San Francisco or any of the places you were talking about where bail reform was implemented.
Right. Yeah.
So it's hard to make the argument that bail reform is responsible for the rise in crime when it rose in places where there was no bail reform.
Yeah. Yeah, I mentioned that. And I think it's particularly ironic that so much was made of the rise in violent crime in Chicago. Like that was the signature crime is out of control with it.
The poster child.
Right.
Yeah.
Within a city that's controlled primarily by progressives. And yet the Pretrial Fairness Act in Illinois was passed after that spike. So you could only argue that it had some retroactive effect, like some time travel thing going on. Certainly within Chicago, there is no cause and effect because the effect would have had to precede the cause.
Yeah. So in summary, it sounds like bail reform's prospects are very much still to be decided. The country is wrestling with this now, and I just hope it's given a chance to flourish and some long-term statistics can come out and show that it's saving money and restoring people's lives because of all those consequences you mentioned, how people lose their jobs and their relationships, their families while they sit in jail.
Yeah. I'm jaded and cynical enough to believe that not much progress is going to be made by talking about how we need to be compassionate for the defendant. Politically, that's a dead end. But I do feel like if more people were talking about the money that's saved, I feel like that would get a lot of attention from people who are maybe undecided on the issue.
Yes.
If it's true that New Jersey saved $1 billion, that's a very big number for so many states that are cash strapped right now. If I were a political consultant, that would be the drum that I would be beating. This is a way to save money.
Yeah, although we've heard about all those Southern governors who have turned down the Medicaid money associated with Obamacare just on principle. Turning down billions of dollars. So, and this is my cynicism now, more likely what we're going to see is a tale of two countries, the MAGA country where people sit in jail forever and run by law and order right-wingers who don't give a crap about the welfare of their people. And then the non-MAGA majority that is trying to implement policies like this to move the needle.
Yeah, I guess we'll see on that. And mansplaining will be there either way.
All right. Well, thank you. That was an interesting conversation. And I suspected your answer would be what it is, but I'm glad the evidence bears out my suspicion.
Yeah. Well, you ready for the next question?
Yes.
Okay. So if you follow sports, and Joe, I know that you do, one of the major stories recently has been the NCAA's groundbreaking agreement that schools will be allowed to pay their players. This is the result of a number of lawsuits brought by players who rightly felt exploited by their schools, and by the NCAA, which set rules prohibiting players from profiting on their own name or likeness for as long as they wanted to maintain their amateur standing and compete in college athletics. This change is already huge, but I recently saw a headline that really took me aback. Apparently, private equity firms are exploring the possibility of investing in college athletic programs. Joe, this seems like madness to me. I'm all for players getting what they're worth, and there's a lot of money in college athletics, But when hedge funds are looking to invest in educational institutions, it seems like everything is going off the rails. So please look into this and give me your best prediction of how these changes will affect college athletics and higher education overall going forward.
Okay, will do. I am also interested in the idea of college athletes getting to earn some money for all the revenue they've been generating for their colleges for decades.
Indeed, yeah.
But I was not aware of this private equity infiltration, but it's not surprising, is it? Where there's money, there's vulture capitalism.
Yeah, the headlines today kind of read like something out of The Onion. There are things that I would think would be laughable that now seem to be kind of part of our life. Let's get into that one in a few weeks and see how things look.
Yeah, okay. Okay, people, if you have any thoughts about this episode of Mansplaining, you want to comment on this episode or any other we've done, please go to our Facebook page, Mansplaining the Podcast. You can like us there. You can like us in real life, too, not just there. But you can also check our sources, leave a comment, give us a question about what you just heard. You can suggest topics for future episodes. We appreciate any and all feedback that you might want to share with us there. And wherever you are listening to this podcast, you're also able to give us a rating, which we would very much appreciate, write a review on whatever app you use to listen to this podcast. We did have a Google voicemail number, 206-486-4074. I think it's still in place. We still offering that set of Ginsu knives, Mark, if people call in the next 30 minutes?
Yeah. I think they're still sharp.
Okay.
I'll give them a test before they go out, but yeah.
All right, good. So that's another thing you can do to support us. But for now, thank you very much for listening. That was Mark, and I'm Joe, and we'll talk to you next time.
See you then.
Never question why the bail was set so high. Just a part of the system, never thought to pry. But now I see the truth, it's crystal clear. Bail's become a trap, fueled by fear. Oh, bail reform, where do we go? Trying to fix a system that's laid so low. In the name of justice, we aim to solve. But politics and fear keep slamming the door. From medieval England to the U.S. today, bail's evolution took a twisted way. Once a promise made by kin so dear, now it's cash that decides if you'll disappear. Oh, bail reform, where do we go? Trying to fix a system that's laid so low. In the name of justice, we aim to solve. But politics and fear keep slamming the door. They say it's for safety, but who's really safe? When wealth decides who rots in a cage, pretrial detention, a life put on hold for those who can't afford the price that's told. Oh, bail reform, where do we go? Trying to fix a system that's laid so low. In the name of justice, we aim to solve. But politics and fear keep slamming the door. But politics and fear keep slamming the door.
Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Music composed and performed by the Mansplaining House Band. Thank you for spending your time with us, and we'll see you next time.